They say the cruelest cage is the one built by your own blood. Damien Voss learned that truth the day his father's throne became his prison, and every breath since has been borrowed time in an empire that devours its kings. But when a nameless healer from the forgotten districts locks eyes with him across a room soaked in noble blood, something ancient and forbidden stirs beneath his ribs, a weakness he cannot afford, a connection that could burn his entire world to ash. This is the story of how an empire built on fear met the one woman it could not break, and how love became the most dangerous weapon of all. If you're watching from the shadows tonight, drop your city in the comments and smash that like button, because this tale gets darker before it gets light, and you'll want to remember where you were when it all began. Bye! The northern wind cut through the palace corridors like a blade seeking bone, and Damien Voss stood at the highest window of the obsidian tower, watching his empire pretend to sleep. 32 years he'd walked this earth, 10 of them wearing the crown that killed his father. The city of Valdris sprawled below him, a beast of stone and smoke that fed on the weak and crowned the ruthless. Somewhere in those tangled streets, people were dying. Somewhere closer, people were plotting his death. He could feel it in his marrow, that particular tension that preceded betrayal. The High Council had been too agreeable lately. Lord Cassian's smile had grown sharper. Even the servants moved differently, their eyes sliding past him like he was already a ghost. Power, his father had told him 3 days before the poison took him, is loneliest at its peak. You'll have everything and trust nothing. Every hand extended is a knife waiting for your back. The old bastard had been right about that, if nothing else. Damien's reflection stared back from the darkened glass. Black hair pulled severe, jaw carved from the same unforgiving stone as the castle itself. Eyes the color of winter storms that never brought mercy. The scar along his left cheekbone was a gift from his coronation when his uncle had tested whether the boy king would bleed like his father or fight like something worse. Damien had crushed the man's windpipe with his bare hands in front of the entire court. The message had been received. The isolation had been instant. A knock shattered his thoughts. "Come in." His first commander, Victor Kane, entered with the measured stride of a man who'd survived 15 years in Damien's service by knowing exactly when to speak and when to breathe quietly. He was broad-shouldered, graying at the temples, with the kind of face that suggested violence was a language he spoke fluently. "My king, we have a situation." Damien didn't turn from the window. Define situation. Lord Heron's son collapsed during the evening banquet. Poison, most likely. He's barely breathing. Which lord is Heron again? The one who controls the eastern grain routes. Victor's tone carried no judgment, but the implication was clear. Heron was too valuable to let die, too dangerous to save carelessly. If the boy dies, Heron will blame us. If he lives, he'll owe us. Either way, it's a complication we didn't need. Damien finally turned, his expression unreadable. Where is he? The lower medical wing. The palace physicians are struggling. Struggling, a polite word for failing. The royal physicians were talented enough at treating injuries from training accidents and overindulgence, but poison was an art form in Valdris, and the artists were always 3 steps ahead of the healers. "Send for someone from the outer districts," Damien said. "Someone who actually knows how to keep people alive when the odds are stacked against them." Victor's eyebrow lifted a fraction. The outer districts. "You think our perfumed court doctors learned their trade in the streets?" Damien moved away from the window, his boots echoing against marble. "Find someone who's earned their skills the hard way. Someone desperate enough to take the risk. The risk being, if the boy dies. Then Heron will have his scapegoat, and I'll have mine." Damien's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Do it now." Victor bowed and left without another word. He'd learned long ago that when the king's voice dropped to that particular register, argument was suicide. Damien descended the tower stairs alone, preferring the cold spiral of stone to the main corridors where eyes followed and ears listened. The palace was a living thing, breathing conspiracy and exhaling ambition. Every conversation was a chess move. Every silence was a threat. He'd been 12 when they'd brought him here, a half-wild boy from the northern mountain territories where his mother had hidden him from court politics. She'd died keeping him secret, buying him 6 years of something resembling childhood. His father had wept when the soldiers finally found him, not from joy, but from guilt. "You should have stayed lost, boy," he'd whispered during their only private conversation. "This place will hollow you out and wear your skin." Another prophecy that had aged like wine. The lower medical wing smelled like copper and fear. Damien could hear the boy before he saw him, wet, struggling breaths that suggested lungs filling with something they shouldn't. Lord Heron stood outside the chamber, his face carved from the same desperate rage that made men dangerous. "My king," Heron's voice cracked. "Please, he's my only son." Damien studied the man with clinical detachment. Heron was 50, maybe 55. Built thick from a youth spent actually working his lands before power had softened him. His hands were shaking. Real fear then, not performance. "Who did this?" Damien asked. Heron's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but when I find them, you'll do nothing without my permission." Damien's voice could have frozen blood. "This happened in my palace. That makes it my problem, which means it's my vengeance to distribute. Understood?" The older man's face went through several emotions before settling on submission. "Understood, my king." Damien entered the chamber. The boy, 18, maybe 19, lay convulsing on a medical cot, his skin the color of old snow. Two physicians hovered uselessly, their hands stained with blood from where they'd tried bleeding out the poison. Medieval thinking that would kill the patient faster than any toxin. "Out!" Damien commanded. "Both of you. My king, we were just about to—" "Now." They fled like roaches from light. Damien approached the dying boy and felt nothing. He'd seen too much death to register each individual tragedy. The kid was a piece on the board, valuable only for what his survival or demise might accomplish. Cold arithmetic dressed up as governance. The door opened behind him. Victor's voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "My king, I found someone. She's unconventional. Bring her in." What entered the room made Damien reassess his definition of unconventional. She was small, maybe 5'4", in the worn boots that had seen more miles than most nobles traveled in a lifetime. Her clothes were layered and patched, practical garments in shades of gray and brown that spoke of someone who valued function over appearance. Dark hair pulled back in a braid that had come half undone. Streaks of something that might have been blood or dirt across her forearms. But it was her face that caught him. Not beautiful in the way court ladies were beautiful, all painted and practiced. This was something raw, high cheekbones, full mouth set in a line that suggested she'd learned not to smile unless she meant it, and eyes the color of honey shot through with green. Those eyes swept the room with the kind of practiced assessment that came from making life or death decisions in the space between heartbeats. She looked at the dying boy, then at Damien, then back at the boy. When she spoke, her voice carried an accent from the southern outer districts, rougher around the edges than court speech, but no less precise. "How long has he been like this?" 2 hours, Victor answered when Damien said nothing. She was already moving toward the patient, hands checking pulse points, peeling back eyelids, smelling the boy's breath. "What did he eat? Everything at the banquet." Victor started. "No." She cut him off without looking up. What did he eat that nobody else ate? Or what did he drink from a cup nobody else touched? Damien found his voice. "You know what this is. It wasn't a question." She glanced at him then, and for a heartbeat their eyes locked. Something passed between them, some current of recognition that made no sense. She looked away first, returning her attention to the dying boy. Night vein extract mixed with something acidic to speed absorption. Maybe wine, maybe citrus juice. Her hands were already working, pulling packets and vials from a worn leather satchel that had appeared from beneath her cloak. "I need clean water, honey if you have it, and activated charcoal. Also something to make him vomit, but he's too far gone for that to matter much." Victor looked at Damien, who nodded. The commander disappeared. "You're calm for someone who just walked into the palace," Damien observed. She was crushing something in a small mortar, her movements efficient. "I'm calm because I'm working. I'll panic later if there's time." "What's your name?" She paused for just a fraction of a second. "Ilara Quinn." "Well, Ilara Quinn, do you know what happens if that boy dies?" She met his eyes again, and this time held them. "I imagine the same thing that happens if I don't try to save him. Someone dies, and someone else gets blamed. The only variable is whether I go down fighting or cowering. Despite everything, the poison, the politics, the weight of the crown pressing down on him like a physical thing, Damien felt his mouth quirk. That might have been the beginning of a smile. He stopped it. Victor returned with the requested items. Alara worked in silence, mixing compounds with the kind of precision that spoke of extensive experience. She forced the mixture down the boy's throat, then began pressing on specific points along his abdomen and chest. "What are you doing?" Damien asked, trying to keep his heart from forgetting how to beat. Her voice was strained with concentration. The poison slows everything down. Heart, lungs, brain. Eventually they stop remembering they're supposed to be working. She kept at it for what felt like an hour, but was probably 15 minutes. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her breathing matched the rhythm of her compressions. And slowly, incrementally, the boy's color began to shift from corpse pale to something approaching living. When his breathing finally steadied, she sat back on her heels, exhausted. He'll live. Keep him hydrated, nothing solid for 2 days, and watch for secondary symptoms. Sometimes a night vein damages the kidneys. Damien had watched the entire process in silence. Now he studied this woman who just saved a noble's life with tools that probably cost less than the boots Victor was wearing. She was shaking slightly, the adrenaline wearing off. "You carry poison antidotes in your bag," he said. "That's an unusual precaution for a healer." Alara stood, wiping her hands on a relatively clean patch of her tunic. In the outer districts, people get creative when they're desperate. Poison's cheaper than a blade and harder to trace. "You've done this before. Too many times." She met his gaze with something that might have been defiance or might have been exhaustion. "Mostly I lose. Tonight I won. Can I leave now?" "No." The word dropped between them like a stone into still water. Her expression shifted, wariness replacing fatigue. "I saved him. That was the job." "The job was to save him," Damien agreed. "The consequence is that now you're valuable, which in this palace makes you dangerous by default. You'll stay here until I decide what to do with you. I don't belong here. Very few people do. Yet here we all are. Victor, have someone prepare quarters in the eastern wing. Make sure she has everything she needs." "I'm not a prisoner?" Alara's voice carried an edge. Damien turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "That depends entirely on your definition of freedom. In this place, everyone's a prisoner of something. At least in the palace, the walls are prettier than the outer districts." He left before she could respond, but he felt her eyes burning into his back. The next 3 days passed in a haze of council meetings and power plays. Lord Heron had indeed been grateful for his son's survival, but gratitude in Valdris was a currency that bought temporary loyalty at best. The High Council was pressing Damien to make a decision on the succession question. He had no heir, no wife, no clear line of continuation. Every meeting was a politely worded reminder that an unmarried king was a temporary king. Lady Morgana of House Blackthorn would make an excellent queen, Lord Cassian suggested during one particularly tedious session. Her family controls the Western mines, and the Alliance would— I'm aware of what the Alliance would accomplish. Damien's voice was flat. I'm also aware that her father has been stockpiling weapons and training private soldiers in violation of crown law. Should I marry the daughter of a man preparing for rebellion, or should I execute them both and be done with it? Cassian's smile didn't waver. Youthful enthusiasm, my king. Lord Blackthorn is simply ensuring his territories are adequately defended. Against what threat exactly? The silence that followed was answer enough. Against you, the room didn't say. Against whatever comes after you. Damien dismissed the council early, ignoring their thinly veiled frustration. He was walking the palace ramparts when he saw her. Alara was in one of the inner courtyards, sitting on a stone bench with her face tilted toward the weak northern sun. She'd been given better clothes, a simple dress in deep blue that actually fit her, but she wore them like a costume she couldn't wait to shed. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of something hot, steam rising into the cold air. He should have kept walking, should have maintained the distance that kept him alive. Instead, he found himself descending the stairs. She noticed him when he was 10 feet away, her body tensing before she recognized him and forced herself to relax. A survival instinct that spoke of practice. My king. She didn't stand, didn't bow, just acknowledged his presence and went back to staring at nothing. Damien sat on the bench without invitation, leaving a careful distance between them. Your patient is recovering well. His father sends his gratitude daily in increasingly expensive forms. Good for him. Her tone suggested she couldn't care less. You don't want the reward? She finally looked at him, and again that jolt of recognition, like touching something electric. I want to leave. That's the only reward I'm interested in. Why? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're serious? You want to know why someone from the outer districts doesn't want to live in a palace where everyone's plotting everyone else's murder? Fair point. Damien found himself studying her profile, the set of her jaw, the way her fingers gripped the cup like she was holding on to something solid in a shifting world. But you're still here, because you won't let me go. Because I haven't decided yet. The distinction matters. Does it? She turned to face him fully. Look, I don't know what game you're playing, and I don't want to. I saved the boy because that's what I do. I don't want gold, I don't want a position, I don't want to be tangled up in whatever political nightmare you people thrive on. I just want to go home and forget this place exists. Home being the outer districts, where people get poisoned often enough that you carry antidotes, where you've seen enough death that you can work on a dying boy without flinching. She flinched now, just slightly. That's different. How? Because there, I chose to care. Her voice went quiet, almost lost in the wind. Here, caring is just another way to be used. Damien felt something shift in his chest, some ancient glacier starting to crack. Who taught you to think like that? Life? Experience. The same teachers you had, I'm guessing. She stood abruptly. I should go. I'm sure you have kingdoms to rule, and I have... What's your story, Ilara Quinn? The question stopped her mid-step. She turned slowly. What? Your story. Everyone has one. The version of themselves they tell when the truth is too complicated. So what's yours? I'm nobody. Just a healer from the southern districts who learned her trade because people needed help and nobody else was offering. That's the summary. I'm asking for the details. Why do you care? Because you looked at me 3 days ago like you saw something worth defying me over. In this palace, people either fear me or try to manipulate me. You did neither. That makes you anomalous. And anomalies in my world tend to be either threats or opportunities. I need to know which. She studied him for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of being dissected, examined for weak points. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone deciding how much truth was survivable. My mother was a midwife. My father ran a tavern in the southern quarter until a protection racket burned it down when I was 8. He died in the fire trying to save the liquor stock because he thought it was worth more than his life. My mother drank herself to death 2 years later. I learned healing because I was angry that nobody helped them, angry that power only protects the powerful, angry that the world is built on the broken backs of people nobody remembers. So I learned to remember them. Every person I save is a small rebellion against a system that says they don't matter. The silence that followed was heavy with things neither of them knew how to articulate. Damien felt seen in a way that was both terrifying and necessary. Your father was wrong, he finally said. His life was worth more than the liquor. Easy to say when you're the one who never had to make that choice. I've made worse ones. Damien stood, suddenly needing to move. I killed my uncle in front of the entire court to prove I wasn't weak. I let border villages burn because rescuing them would have shown strategic vulnerability. I've sacrificed people who trusted me because the mathematics of power demanded it. So yes, I know about choices that leave blood on your hands and ice in your chest. Then why are you still doing it? Why not walk away? Because walking away means someone worse takes the throne. Because the system doesn't collapse just because I'm tired of feeding it. Because... He stopped, the words lodging in his throat. Because he was his father's son, and his father's dying wish had been for Damien to be better than the empire that created them both. So far, he was failing spectacularly. Ilara moved closer, close enough that he could smell herbs and something faintly floral beneath the palace soap they'd given her. Because you think you can fix it from the inside. Can I? She smiled, sad and knowing. That's what everyone who becomes part of the system tells themselves. Right up until they realize they've become the thing they wanted to change. The words hit like a physical blow because they were true. Damien had felt it happening, that slow erosion of principles beneath the grinding necessity of survival. Each compromise, each calculated cruelty, each time he chose empire over empathy, he was becoming the very thing he'd sworn to dismantle. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "Maybe I'm already lost." Alara reached out, her hand stopping just short of touching his arm. "Then let me go before I get lost too." Before Damien could respond, Victor appeared at the courtyard entrance, his expression grim. "My king, we have a problem." Several problems, actually. Define several. Lord Cassian has called an emergency council session. They're citing precedent about the king's duty to secure succession, and there are rumors spreading through the city about the girl. Both Damien and Alara tensed. What kind of rumors? Victor's eyes flicked to Alara, then back to Damien. That she's not just a healer, that her bloodline is significant. Damien felt the temperature drop. How significant? Significant enough that 3 different factions are preparing to either kill her or kidnap her, depending on whether they think she's an asset or a threat. Alara's voice was tight. "My bloodline? I'm nobody. I told you, apparently the High Council disagrees." Victor's tone was carefully neutral. "They've been researching the Quinn family line. It seems your great-grandmother was someone important, someone whose existence was supposed to have been erased from the records." "Who?" Damien's voice carried command weight. "Alara Quinn is the direct descendant of Meredith Thorne, the last surviving bloodline of the Thorne dynasty." The world tilted. The Thorne dynasty had founded the Alpha system 300 years ago, establishing the framework that gave certain bloodlines the right to rule. They'd been wiped out in the Crimson Purge, every last member supposedly executed to make way for the Voss bloodline. If even one Thorne survived, if their line continued, it would make Alara's very existence a challenge to every Alpha throne in the Empire. Damien looked at the woman beside him, this small, fierce healer who'd walked into his palace wanting nothing but escape. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes blazed with something between fury and terror. "You're lying," she said to Victor. "You have to be lying." Victor pulled out a folded document, official seals and all. "The council doesn't lie about bloodlines. They manipulate them, weaponize them, but they don't fabricate them. It's too easy to disprove." Damien took the document, scanned it with growing horror. The genealogy was detailed, traced through female lines and assumed names, a 300-year game of hide and survive. And at the bottom, circled in red ink, Alara Quinn, last confirmed Thorne descendant. He looked at her. "Did you know?" "No." Her voice shook. "My mother never... She told me we were nobody, that our family survived by being forgettable. She made me promise never to look too closely, never to ask questions about where we came from. She was protecting you." Damien's mind was already racing through scenarios, each one worse than the last. If this becomes public knowledge, it already is. Victor's expression was grim. Cassian made sure of it. The emergency session is in 1 hour. They're going to demand you either marry her to neutralize the bloodline threat or execute her to eliminate it permanently. Alara made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sob. "So my choices are be a political pawn or die." "Fantastic." Damien's jaw clenched. "There's a third option. Which is, we run, both of us, tonight." Victor's eyes widened. "My king, you can't be serious. Do I look like I'm joking?" Damien's voice cut like broken glass. "They've been waiting for an excuse to remove me. This is it. They'll use her bloodline to declare my rule illegitimate, install some puppet they can control. I've seen this play before. My father described it to me 3 days before they poisoned him. Then fight them." Victor's voice carried desperation. "You're the Alpha King. You command the military, I command loyalty until I don't. How many of my soldiers do you think will follow orders when the High Council declares me a usurper protecting a Thorne? How long do you think we'd last in a siege?" The courtyard had gone silent, except for the wind. Alara spoke, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "You'd give up everything for someone you met 3 days ago?" Damien met her gaze, and for the first time in 10 years, he told the complete truth. "I'd give up everything for the chance to stop being what this place made me. You asked why I'm still doing this. The answer is I don't know anymore. But I know I don't want to execute someone just because their blood threatens mine. I know I'm tired of being the kind of king who makes that calculation. This is insane. Alara's hands were shaking. We don't even know each other. No. But I know you're the first person in a decade who looked at me and saw a human being instead of a crown. And I know that if I let them kill you, there's no coming back from that. I'll be exactly what they want, a monster who rules because he's too broken to do anything else. Victor stepped forward. If you do this, there's no return. You'll be hunted, both of you. Then we'd better run fast. Damien turned to Alara. I'm not ordering you. I'm asking. Come with me. Help me dismantle this system from outside before it crushes us both from within. Or stay, take your chances with the council, maybe survive as a political prisoner. Your choice. Alara looked at the palace, at Victor, at the document that said her blood was a weapon she never wanted to wield. Then she looked at Damien, this cold king who'd just offered to throw away an empire. I must be out of my mind. She took a shaky breath. But yes, let's run. The hour before the council session moved like a knife fight, fast, brutal, precise. Victor, despite his reservations, helped them prepare. He knew Damien well enough to understand when arguing was futile. Take the northern passage, he instructed, marking a map. It leads to the old catacombs. From there you can reach the outer walls without being seen. I'll delay the council as long as I can. You'll be executed for this. Damien's voice carried gratitude and grief in equal measure. Victor's smile was grim. I've been expecting execution for 15 years. At least this time it'll be for something that matters. He clasped Damien's arm. Be better than this place, my king. Be what your father wanted. Damien didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded. They moved through the palace like ghosts, keeping to servant passages and forgotten corridors. Alara followed Damien's lead, her breath coming quick but controlled. She tied her hair back, changed into traveling clothes, moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to disappear when necessary. They were almost to the northern passage when they heard footsteps. Cassian stepped from the shadows, flanked by 6 armed guards. His smile was a blade wrapped in silk. Leaving so soon, my king? The council session hasn't even started. Damien's hand went to the sword at his hip. Out of my way, Cassian. I'm afraid I can't do that. Cassian's eyes flicked to Alara. The Thorn heir needs to answer for her bloodline, and you need to answer for protecting her. Her bloodline is her own business. She didn't ask to be born. No, but she exists nonetheless. An existence, in this case, is treason. Cassian gestured to the guards. Take them both. Alive preferably, but use your judgment. The guards advanced. Damien drew his sword, the blade singing in the cold air. Alara pressed against his back, and he could feel her trembling. Stay behind me, he murmured. The first guard lunged. Damien parried, riposted, felt the blade bite flesh. The man went down screaming. The others hesitated. She's unarmed, Cassian said calmly. Just kill the king and take the girl. 4 men charged simultaneously. Damien fought like something feral, 10 years of court training meeting the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. He dropped 2 more guards, took a slash across his ribs that burned like fire, kept moving. Behind him, Alara grabbed a fallen guard's dagger. When the 4th man tried to grab her, she buried the blade in his shoulder with a precision that spoke of practice. He stumbled back, shocked. Impressive, Cassian observed. The Thorn bloodline breeds survivors, apparently. Damien killed the last guard and leveled his bloody sword at Cassian. Last chance. Walk away. Cassian didn't move. You know I can't do that. You know what happens next. Then let's get it over with. What happened next would be argued about in taverns for years. Some said Damien moved first. Others claimed Cassian drew a hidden blade. What everyone agreed on was the sound. Steel on steel, then steel on flesh, then silence. When it was over, Cassian lay on the stone floor, blood pooling beneath him. His eyes held surprise more than pain. You were supposed to be predictable, he whispered. That was your fatal flaw. Too controlled to ever... He died mid-sentence. Damien stood over him, breathing hard, the wound in his ribs bleeding through his shirt. Alara was at his side immediately, her hands already assessing the damage. How bad? He managed. Bad enough. She was tearing cloth, pressing it against the wound. We need to move, now. They ran. Through this northern passage, down into the catacombs where ancient alphas slept in stone. The walls were carved with victories and warnings, the weight of history pressing down like a physical thing. Behind them, alarm bells started ringing, the palace waking to betrayal. "This way," Damien gasped, one hand pressed to his ribs. "There's a door, old smuggling route." He stumbled. Alara caught him, her small frame somehow supporting his weight. "Stay with me. You don't get to die before you explain what the hell we're doing. Surviving." His vision was starting to blur at the edges. "New concept for me. Not sure I'm good at it." "Then let me teach you." Her voice was fierce. "I've been surviving my entire life. Your turn to learn." They found the door, an ancient thing that groaned when Damien threw his weight against it. Beyond lay darkness and the smell of river water. The outer wall, freedom, exile. Behind them, footsteps echoed in the catacombs. Voices shouting orders. The Empire mobilizing to crush its fleeing king. Damien looked at Alara, this woman whose blood was a crown she never wanted, whose existence had just cost him everything. She looked back, her honey-green eyes bright with fear and determination. "No going back now," she said. "Never was," he replied. They stepped through the door together into the darkness beyond the palace walls. Behind them, the Alpha King's empire roared its fury. Ahead lay nothing but uncertainty and the slim chance of something better. The door swung shut. The lock clicked home. And somewhere in the palace above, Victor faced the High Council alone, buying time with his life for a king who'd finally chosen mercy over power. The game had changed. The pieces were in motion. And the real war was just beginning. The river water was black as old blood and twice as cold. Damien felt it seeping through his boots, through the wound in his ribs, through whatever was left of the man who'd worn a crown 6 hours ago. Alara was ahead of him, moving through the smuggler's tunnel with the sure-footedness of someone who'd learned to navigate darkness without flinching. The tunnels ran beneath the outer wall like veins beneath skin, carved out over centuries by people who'd understood that empires were only as solid as their secrets. Damien's father had shown him these passages once, during one of their rare moments of honest conversation. "Every king needs an escape route, boy. Not because running is noble, but because sometimes survival is the only victory left." He'd been 14. He'd thought his father was a coward for even suggesting retreat. Now, bleeding and exiled, he understood. Survival wasn't cowardice, it was spite dressed up as strategy. How much farther? His voice echoed wrong in the confined space, bouncing back at him like an accusation. Alara glanced back, her face a pale blur in the darkness. "Another 100 yards, maybe. There's a grate that opens into the Lowtown Market District. From there, we disappear." Disappear. As if a 6'2" former king with a bleeding sword wound could just blend into the crowd. As if his face hadn't been on every coin and banner in the empire for a decade. But she was right about the principle. In the outer districts, people had practice at not seeing things that could get them killed. The grate opened into an alley that smelled like rotting vegetables and desperate choices. Dawn was breaking over Valdris, painting the smoke-choked sky in shades of rust and ash. The market was already moving, people setting up stalls, calling out prices, negotiating the small transactions that kept the lower classes from open revolt. Damien pulled his cloak tight, hiding the blood and the sword. Alara led him through the crowd with practiced ease, weaving between vendors and beggars, her hand occasionally touching his arm to guide him. Every touch felt electric, some current passing between them that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with that moment in the courtyard when they'd both seen something in each other worth the gamble. They ducked into a building that might have been a tavern once, before time and neglect had reduced it to a glorified shelter. A woman stood behind a makeshift bar, her face carved from hard years and harder choices. She looked at Alara, and something passed between them, some recognition that didn't need words. "Mara," Alara said, "I need the room." The woman's eyes flicked to Damien, taking in the blood, the sword, the bearing that marked him as someone used to giving orders. Her expression didn't change. The room costs extra when it comes with trouble. Damien reached into his cloak, pulled out a gold coin worth more than this entire building. "This enough?" Mara took the coin, bit it, pocketed it. "Upstairs. 3rd door. You've got until nightfall, then the price goes up or you go out. Fair enough." They climbed stairs that groaned with rot. The room was barely large enough for a bed and a washstand, the window covered with boards that let in slivers of gray light. Alara closed the door, turned to face him. Sit. Let me look at that wound. Damien sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly aware of how much blood he'd lost, how the adrenaline was wearing off and leaving only pain and exhaustion in its wake. He pulled off his shirt and heard Alara's sharp intake of breath. It's worse than I thought. How bad? Her hands were already working, cleaning the wound with water from a jug that had seen better days. Bad enough that you'll need stitches. Bad enough that if it gets infected, you'll die. But not bad enough to kill you right now if we're careful. Comforting. I don't deal in comfort. She threaded a needle with practiced efficiency. I deal in truth. This is gonna hurt. It did. Damien felt each stitch like a separate betrayal, his body reminding him that kings bleed the same as everyone else. He focused on his breathing, on the rhythm Alara maintained, on anything except the fact that he'd just destroyed everything he'd spent 10 years building. Why did you help me? The question came out before he could stop it. In the courtyard, you could have told Cassian where to find us, could have bargained for your freedom. Alara didn't pause in her stitching. You think I didn't consider it, did you? For about 3 seconds. Then I remembered that men like Cassian don't negotiate with people like me. They use us until we're empty, then discard the shell. At least with you, I knew what I was getting. A king too stubborn to be smart and too honest to be good at politics. That's not exactly a glowing endorsement. It's an honest one. She tied off the last stitch, sat back. There's a difference between a man who kills because he likes it and a man who kills because he thinks he has to. You're the second kind. Still dangerous, still complicit, but maybe salvageable. Damien looked at her, this woman who just stitched him back together while delivering judgment on his entire existence. Salvageable. Like I'm some broken thing you can repair, aren't you? The question hung between them, brutal in its simplicity. Was he broken? Yes. Had this empire fractured him into something barely functional? Absolutely. But salvageable suggested a possibility of healing, of becoming something other than the weapon his throne had forged him into. I don't know, he admitted. 10 years I've been king, 10 years of calculated cruelty and strategic sacrifice. I don't know if there's enough left of whoever I was before to rebuild from. Alara stood, moved to the window, peered through the gaps in the boards. Then maybe you stop trying to rebuild and start building something new. You're not that king anymore. You gave up the crown when you walked out that door. Now you're just a man who bleeds and runs and has to decide what the hell he stands for when nobody's forcing him to stand for anything. The words struck like hammers. She was right. He wasn't King Damien Voss anymore. That man had died in the palace corridors when he'd chosen mercy over power. The question was who the hell he became next. Outside, the city was waking to the news. They could hear it in the changing tenor of the crowd noise, the way conversation shifted from haggling to speculation. The Alpha King had fled. The Thorn heir had escaped. The High Council was offering rewards, threatening consequences, mobilizing the full weight of imperial power to crush the runners before they could become something more dangerous than fugitives. Damien stood carefully, testing the stitches. We need to move before they lock down the district. Where? Alara's voice carried the weight of someone asking a question with no good answers. North. The mountain territories where I was born. My mother's people might still remember me, might offer shelter. Might is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It's all I've got. He met her eyes. Unless you have a better plan. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, south. To the coastal cities. There are people there, smugglers and free traders who don't give a damn about imperial politics. We could disappear in the shipping routes, work passage on a merchant vessel, get far enough away that the council's reach doesn't matter. Damien considered it. The coastal cities were lawless by design, built on commerce and compromise rather than bloodlines and power. A place where exiled kings and unexpected heirs could theoretically vanish into the chaos. But running that far meant abandoning any chance of coming back, meant accepting exile as permanent rather than tactical. And some part of him, some stupid, stubborn part that still believed in salvaging something from the wreckage, couldn't quite let go. What if we don't run? He said slowly. Alara turned to stare at him. What? What if we stop running and start fighting? Not the way they expect, not army against army, but fighting the system itself, exposing the corruption, rallying the outer districts,
building something that challenges the council's authority from the ground up. You're insane. Her voice was flat. They'll kill us. They're already trying to kill us. At least this way we die for something that matters.
She laughed, bitter and sharp. You want to start a revolution with no army, no resources, no allies, and a price on both our heads. That's not bravery. That's suicide with delusions of grandeur. Maybe. Damien felt the fire building in his chest, the same fire that had driven him to kill Cassian, to choose humanity over strategy. But Victor died buying us time. My father died trying to teach me there was a better way. How many more people have to die feeding this system before someone stands up and says enough? The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and dread. Alara studied him like she was trying to decide if he was worth the inevitable catastrophe his plan would unleash. If we do this, she finally said, we do it smart. No grand gestures, no stupid heroics. We build from the shadows, find the cracks in the council's power, exploit every weakness. And if it looks like we're losing, we run. Deal, deal. The word sealed something between them, some pact that went deeper than strategy. They were in this together now, for better or catastrophically worse. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of movement and calculation. Mara, it turned out, was more than just a tavern keeper. She was a node in a network of people who'd learned to survive in the spaces between imperial oversight. Smugglers, information brokers, black market healers, all connected by the shared understanding that the system only worked for those at the top, and everyone else had to get creative. She introduced them to Kael, a former military strategist who'd been dishonorably discharged for questioning orders during a village pacification that had turned into a massacre. He was lean and sharp-eyed, with the kind of intensity that came from believing the world could be better and hating it for falling short. "You're the king," he said when Damien met him in a basement that smelled like old wine and older secrets. The one who ran. Former king. And yes, I ran. Damien didn't flinch from the assessment. I ran because staying meant becoming the monster they needed me to be. Kael studied him for a long moment. And now? Now I want to burn the system down and build something better from the ashes. A slow smile spread across Kael's face. Finally. Someone who gets it. He pulled out a map of the Empire, marked with notations in code. I've been tracking council movements for 3 years. Supply routes, military rotations, political alliances. They're strong, but they're not invulnerable. They've made enemies. We just need to unite those enemies. Alara leaned over the map. Who are we talking about? Everyone the council has screwed over in the name of maintaining power. Kael's finger traced lines across the parchment. The border territories who pay taxes and get nothing but contempt. The merchant guilds who are strangled by regulations that only benefit noble houses. The military officers who are tired of executing civilians in the name of stability. There's an entire empire of resentment waiting for someone to organize it into action. Damien felt something shifting in his chest, some crystallization of purpose. This was it. This was how you fought a system built on fear. You gave the fearful something to rally around. How do we start? Kael grinned. We start by making you a symbol instead of a king. Over the following weeks, they built something that looked like hope and felt like rebellion. Kael had contacts throughout the outer districts, people who remembered what justice was supposed to look like before power had corrupted it beyond recognition. They spread word carefully, coded messages passed through market transactions and tavern conversations, each one carrying the same basic truth. The Alpha King had fallen, but the fight for something better had just begun. Alara became the voice of the movement in ways Damien couldn't. She knew these people, understood their struggles in a way his royal upbringing never could. She spoke in town squares and workers' halls, telling the story of the Thorn bloodline not as a claim to power, but as a reminder that the current system was built on lies and murder. The council wants you to believe they rule by divine right, she told a crowd of dock workers in the southern district. They want you to think the Alpha bloodlines are sacred, that questioning them is treason. But I'm living proof that they built their throne on the corpses of people who had just as much right to rule. And if they can lie about that, what else are they lying about? The crowd roared, not with blind fury, but with the awakening of people who'd been told they were powerless, finally realizing they outnumbered their oppressors. Damien watched from the shadows, feeling pride and fear in equal measure. This was working. Too well, maybe. The kind of movement they were building didn't stay secret for long. 3 weeks after their escape, the council struck back. It started with arrests. People who'd been seen talking to Alara, who'd attended gatherings, who'd been stupid enough or brave enough to speak openly about change. The prisons filled with bodies, the public squares filled with executions. Lord Heron, grateful as he'd been for his son's survival, put a price on both their heads that would make any mercenary rich for life. The military began sweeping the outer districts, using the promise of reform as an excuse to crack down harder than ever. "We have to stop," Mara said during one of their increasingly tense planning sessions. "People are dying. Real people with families and futures, dying because we gave them hope." Damien felt the weight of every execution like stones piling on his chest. She was right. They were right. People were dying because he'd decided his conscience mattered more than their safety. Alara's voice cut through his spiral. "They were dying before we started. They were just doing it quietly, ground down by a system that treats them like fuel to burn. At least now they're dying for something. That's not comfort." Damien's voice was raw. "That's just reframing slaughter as sacrifice." She turned on him, eyes blazing. "Then what do you want to do? Surrender? Walk back to the palace and let them execute us as an example? That won't bring those people back. It'll just prove that resistance is futile, that power always wins, that nothing ever changes." The room went silent. Kyle was watching them both with the careful attention of someone witnessing a fracture that could split everything they'd built. Damien stood, paced the small room like a caged animal. There has to be a middle path, something between total surrender and escalating violence. There isn't. Alara's voice had gone cold. That's the lie powerful people tell themselves to feel better about the choices they make. There's no gentle revolution. There's no bloodless transition. Power doesn't give itself up peacefully. It has to be torn away. She was right, and he hated her for it. Hated the way she articulated the truth he'd been avoiding. Change required sacrifice, and sacrifice meant blood, and blood meant he was back to being the kind of man who calculated deaths in service of a larger goal. Full circle to the monster he'd fled the palace to stop being. That night, unable to sleep, Damien found Alara on the roof of their current safe house, staring at the palace in the distance. Its towers were lit against the night sky, a monument to power and permanence. He sat beside her without speaking. The silence between them had changed over the weeks, becoming less about caution and more about understanding. They'd seen each other at their worst, bleeding, desperate, furious at the impossible choices exile demanded. "I'm sorry," he finally said, "for dragging you into this, for thinking we could fight an empire with good intentions and borrowed courage." "You didn't drag me." Alara's voice was quiet. "I chose this. Every step, every risk, every consequence. I chose it because the alternative was living on my knees. People are dying because we chose defiance over survival. People were always dying." She turned to look at him, and in the moonlight, her face was carved from something harder than anger. The difference is now they're dying awake instead of asleep. They know the system is broken. They know there's another way, even if we fail to build it. That knowledge alone is dangerous to the council. Is it enough? "I don't know." She looked back at the palace. "But it's more than we had before." Damien felt something settle in his chest, some acceptance of the war they'd started and the casualties it would demand. This was the cost of change. This was the price of believing something better was possible. He reached for her hand without thinking. She didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time. Two people who'd lost everything except each other, and the dangerous belief that their losses might mean something. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Cale burst into their planning session with a document he'd acquired through channels he refused to name. It was a High Council memorandum, sealed with official marks that proved its authenticity. "The Council is planning a purge." Cale's voice shook with controlled rage. "Not just of our supporters, of anyone in the outer districts who might be sympathetic. They're calling it Operation Cleansing. 3 divisions, systematic sweeps authorized to use lethal force at discretion." "When?" Damien felt ice forming in his veins. 2 days. They're mobilizing now." Alara grabbed the document, scanned it with growing horror. "This isn't about us anymore. This is about terror. They're going to slaughter thousands of people just to prove they still have control. The room went silent. This was the moment Damien had been dreading, the point where abstract strategy collided with concrete atrocity. They could run, disappear into the coastal cities Alara had suggested, let the council exhaust itself on empty districts. Or they could fight, knowing they were outmatched and outgunned, knowing it would probably end in their deaths. There was no good choice, just the one that let him sleep at night versus the one that haunted him forever. We fight. His voice was steady. We warn the districts, evacuate who we can, and we make the council pay for every inch of ground. That's suicide. Mara's face had gone pale. They have armies. We have... what? A few hundred supporters with makeshift weapons? We have righteousness and rage. Kale's smile was wolfish. And we have the one thing the council never prepared for. An alpha king who fights alongside his people instead of sacrificing them. Damien looked at Alara, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. This was it. The point of no return. They could turn back now, choose survival over principle, or they could step forward into almost certain death for the slim chance that their defiance might inspire something larger. She nodded once, decisive. Then it's decided. Damien stood, feeling the weight of command settling on his shoulders differently than it had when he'd worn a crown. This wasn't power derived from bloodlines and tradition. This was earned through shared struggle and mutual risk. Tell everyone we have. Evacuate the young and old. Everyone else who wants to fight, arm them with whatever we have. We make our stand in the warehouse district. Narrow streets, good cover, lots of ways to disappear if it goes wrong. It's going to go wrong, Mara said. Probably, but at least we'll go down swinging instead of on our knees. They worked through the night, a desperate scramble of logistics and fear. Messages were sent through their network, warnings delivered by runners who risked execution just carrying the news. Weapons were distributed, mostly improvised, nothing that would stand up to military steel, but enough to make the council bleed for their brutality. Alara organized the evacuation with ruthless efficiency, prioritizing children and the elderly, making impossible choices about who got space on the carts heading to the border territories. Damien watched her work and saw the healer she'd been transformed by necessity into something harder, someone who understood that saving some meant condemning others. The night before the purge, she found him checking weapons in a warehouse that smelled like rust and revolution. You should run. Her voice was matter-of-fact. You're the symbol they're really after. If you disappear, maybe they'll call this off. You know that's not true. No, but I had to say it. She moved closer, close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the toll this was taking. I don't want you to die for me. I'm not dying for you. Damien set down the sword he'd been sharpening. I'm dying for the chance that something better might grow from our corpses. There's a difference. Is there? He reached for her, pulled her close, felt her trembling against him. This woman who'd stitched him back together, who'd challenged every assumption he'd built his life around, who'd shown him that mercy wasn't weakness and defiance wasn't futile. When he kissed her, it tasted like goodbye and beginning in equal measure. She kissed him back with the fierce desperation of someone who knew tomorrow might not come. When they finally broke apart, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. If we survive this, we won't. If we survive this, she insisted, we build something better. No more alpha kings, no more bloodline bullshit, just people trying to not destroy each other. Damien smiled despite everything. That's a low bar, and yet the Empire keeps failing to clear it. They spent the night together in that warehouse, wrapped in each other and borrowed blankets, pretending dawn wouldn't come with 3 divisions of soldiers intent on massacre. But dawn came anyway, merciless and inevitable. The first sounds of the purge were boots on cobblestones, systematic and awful. The council forces moved in formation, sweeping through the outer districts with the cold efficiency of people following orders they didn't question. Damien stood in the warehouse district with 300 people who'd chosen to fight. Most were workers and craftspeople, people who'd never held weapons in anger, but knew instinctively that running only delayed the inevitable. Kyle had organized them into defensive positions, turning the narrow streets into a maze of ambush points. Alara was beside him, a borrowed blade at her hip, her healer's hand steady despite what was coming. When this is over, Damien said quietly, when they tell stories about how it ended, I want them to know we chose this, that we weren't defeated, We were defiant. She squeezed his hand once, fierce and final. Then let's give them a story worth remembering. The soldiers appeared at the far end of the main avenue, 3 columns deep, armor gleaming in the early light. At their head rode Lord Heron himself, his face carved from vengeance and righteousness. His voice boomed across the distance. By order of the High Council, all persons in this district are under arrest for treason and conspiracy. Surrender now and face trial. Resist and face immediate execution. Damien stepped forward, shedding his cloak so they could see him clearly. A murmur ran through the soldiers. Some recognized him. Some remembered when he'd been their king. The only treason here is yours. His voice carried command even without a crown. You follow orders from a council that treats citizens like property, that murders anyone who questions their authority, that built an empire on lies and maintains it through fear. I was that system. I fed it for 10 years, and I'm here to tell you, it's not worth the blood on your hands. Lord Heron's face twisted. Seize him and execute anyone who stands in your way. The soldiers advanced, and Damien's people, outnumbered and outmatched, raised their makeshift weapons and stood their ground. The battle that followed would be remembered in whispered stories for generations, not because it was glorious, it wasn't, war never was, but because 300 people with everything to lose chose defiance over survival, and in that choice proved something the Empire had tried for centuries to suppress. That power feared the powerless most when they stopped being afraid. The first blood spilled belonged to a boy who couldn't have been more than 16. Damien watched him fall, watched the light leave his eyes as a soldier's blade found his throat, and felt something fundamental crack inside his chest. This was the cost. This was always the cost. Every revolution was built on the bodies of people too young to have earned their deaths. The warehouse district became a killing ground. Narrow streets that should have favored the defenders instead became coffins, trapping Damien's people between trained soldiers and their own desperate courage. The makeshift weapons broke against military steel. The improvised tactics crumbled under disciplined formation. Within the first 10 minutes, Damien understood with crystalline clarity that they were going to lose. Not just lose the battle, lose everything. He fought anyway. Muscle memory from 10 years of combat training took over, his sword finding gaps in armor, his body moving through the chaos with the fluid precision of someone who'd been bred for violence. Around him, people were dying, people who'd trusted him, people who'd believed his promise that defiance mattered more than survival. He'd lied. Not intentionally, but the result was the same. They were dying for nothing. Alara fought beside him, her healer's knowledge of anatomy making her unexpectedly lethal. She knew where to cut to disable, where to stab to kill quickly. Every motion was efficient, economical, the same precision she'd used saving lives now repurposed for ending them. The transformation should have horrified him. Instead, he felt a surge of something that might have been pride or might have been grief for what this war was turning them both into. A soldier lunged at her from the side. Damien intercepted the blade, felt it scrape along his ribs where Alara's stitches had barely healed. The pain was white-hot and clarifying. He drove his sword through the man's chest, watched surprise bloom across a face too young for this kind of death. They all were. Every single one of them, on both sides, too young to be feeding an empire's appetite for control. "Fall back!" Kyle,'s voice cut through the chaos. He was bloodied but standing, organizing a retreat toward the secondary positions. Fall back before they surround us. The retreat was a controlled collapse, people scrambling through alleyways while others held the line long enough for their escape. Damien grabbed Alara's arm, pulled her away from a soldier she'd been trading blows with. The man pursued for 3 steps, then took an arrow through the eye socket from one of Kyle's archers. He dropped without a sound. They'd made it perhaps 2 blocks when the real catastrophe revealed itself. The secondary positions were already overrun, not by Lord Heron's forces advancing from the front, but by a completely different military unit attacking from behind. They wore the silver and black of the King's elite guard, the personal regiment that had supposedly remained neutral after Damien's exile. Except they weren't neutral. They were executing anyone who'd fought alongside the former king with systematic efficiency. Damien felt the world tilt. The elite guard answered directly to the throne, which meant they answered to whoever the High Council had installed in his absence. This wasn't just a purge of rebels.
This was a coordinated extermination designed to erase any possibility of Damien ever reclaiming power. "We're surrounded." Alara's voice was tight with understanding. They planned this. They knew exactly where we'd retreat. The realization hit like a physical blow. Someone had given the council their defensive positions. Someone inside their network had sold them out. Kael appeared beside them, breathing hard. "There's a drainage tunnel 2 streets over. I can get maybe 30 people through before they close the net. The rest would die buying time for those 30 to escape." The math was brutal and inescapable. Damien had made these calculations before, weighing lives against strategic value. He'd just never been on the losing side of the equation. "Get the wounded out first." His voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "Then anyone under 20. After that, it's whoever can run fastest. You're not seriously planning to stay." Alara grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "I'm the target they really want. If I surrender, maybe they'll let the others." "You know that's not true." Her eyes were wild with fear and fury. "You know they'll kill everyone here regardless. Surrendering just means dying for nothing instead of fighting to the end." She was right. Of course she was right. But the weight of watching his people die was crushing him, grinding him down into someone who just wanted the guilt to stop. A horn sounded, clear and terrible. The elite guard was closing in. From the front, Lord Heron's forces were regrouping for a final push. They had maybe 5 minutes before the trap sealed completely. "Everyone who can fight, form up on me." Damien's command voice cut through the panic. "Everyone else, go with Kael. Now." The group split with heartbreaking efficiency. Damien found himself with roughly 70 people, most of them already wounded, all of them understanding this was a suicide stand. Alara refused to leave, positioning herself at his shoulder with a stubbornness that would have been admirable if it wasn't so absolutely stupid. "You should be with the evacuation," he said quietly. "You should be a lot of things." She checked her blade, her hands shaking slightly. Too late for should now. The elite guard hit them like a hammer against an anvil. These weren't conscripts following orders. These were career soldiers who'd spent years training for exactly this kind of urban warfare. They moved in coordinated units, covering each other's advances, exploiting every gap in the defenders' improvised formation. Damien killed 4 of them in the first minute. It didn't matter. For every one that fell, 2 more pressed forward. His people were being cut down, their courage meaning nothing against superior numbers and training. This was how it ended then. Not in glory or triumph, but in blood and failure and the bitter understanding that he'd led good people to pointless deaths. A blade found his shoulder, driving deep enough to make his left arm go numb. He stumbled, and an elite guard soldier moved in for the kill. Alara intercepted him, her knife finding the gap beneath his helmet. The man fell, and she dragged Damien backward toward a partially collapsed building. "Stay down," she hissed. The world was fragmenting, coming apart in pieces. Damien's vision tunneled, the blood loss catching up with exhaustion and despair. Through the haze, he saw Kael fighting near the drainage tunnel, trying to buy seconds for people to escape. He saw Mara fall beneath 3 soldiers, her defiant scream cut short by steel. He saw everything he'd tried to build crumbling into ash and failure. Then he saw something that made no sense. Victor. His former first commander, the man who'd helped them escape, who'd supposedly died buying them time. Walking through the carnage in full military regalia, very much alive, very much in command of the elite guard forces that were butchering Damien's people. The betrayal was so absolute, so fundamentally incomprehensible, that for several heartbeats Damien simply couldn't process it. Victor had been his most trusted advisor, his friend, if kings were allowed such things. The man who'd taught him strategy, who'd stood beside him through countless crises, who'd supposedly sacrificed himself for Damien's escape. All of it a lie. Victor's eyes found Damien across the battlefield. Something passed between them, recognition, regret, calculation. Then Victor raised his hand and the elite guard stopped advancing. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the chaos had been. Damien Voss. Victor's voice carried authority that made soldiers snap to attention. "Surrender yourself, and I'll let the survivors leave. You have my word." Alara's hand tightened on Damien's good arm. Don't you dare believe him." But Damien was already standing, already stepping into the open.
His body moved on autopilot, while his mind tried to reconcile the man he'd trusted with the architect of this massacre. Why? The question came out raw, stripped of everything except genuine confusion. Victor's expression didn't change. Because someone had to save the empire from your conscience. You were a good king when you were cold, when you calculated deaths without feeling them. The moment you started caring, you became dangerous to everything we'd built. We built nothing. Damien's voice gained strength, fueled by rage that was finally finding a target. We maintained a system of oppression dressed up as order. Yes. Victor's agreement was matter of fact. And that system, however flawed, kept millions of people alive and fed and relatively safe. Your revolution would have plunged the empire into civil war, thousands dead, probably hundreds of thousands before any new order established itself. I chose stability over your newfound morality. By slaughtering people who wanted basic dignity, by ending a rebellion before it metastasized into something worse. Victor took 3 steps forward, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. I know you, Damien. I trained you. I understand how you think. This guilt you're feeling right now, this horror at the casualties, 6 months ago you wouldn't have felt it. You would have made the same choice I'm making now. The only difference is I didn't let sentiment make me weak. The words cut deeper than any blade because they contain truth. 6 months ago, Damien would have calculated this situation in pure strategic terms. Acceptable losses in service of maintaining control. He would have been the man giving Victor's orders. Meeting Alara had changed him. Not just meeting her, choosing mercy, choosing the possibility that power could mean something other than control. That change had felt like salvation. Victor was arguing it was damnation dressed up as enlightenment. So you sold us out from the beginning. Damien's voice was hollow. The escape, the network, all of it was theater so you could identify everyone who might support me. Victor's smile was small and sad. You made it easy. Your need to be better than your throne, to prove you weren't the monster it required. Predictable. Exploitable. I knew you'd try to build something rather than simply run. I just had to be patient and let you gather all the potential threats in one place. Around them, the surviving defenders were being disarmed and forced to their knees. Roughly 40 people left alive out of the 300 who'd stood that morning. The math was devastating. Alara's voice cut through the horror. You were his friend. Victor's eyes shifted to her, and something that might have been genuine regret crossed his features. I was his teacher first. My job was to prepare him to rule an empire that devours the weak and forgives nothing. He learned those lessons well until you made him forget them. I didn't make him forget anything. Alara stood despite the weapons trained on her. I reminded him he was human before he was a king. That's not weakness. That's the only thing that separates rulers from tyrants. And yet here we are. Victor gestured at the carnage. Your humanity bought you nothing but corpses and failure. His ruthlessness built an empire that, for all its flaws, functions. Which approach seems more viable? The philosophical debate was obscene against the backdrop of bodies and blood. Damien felt something breaking inside him, some last connection to the man he'd been trying to become. Victor was right about the outcome, wrong about everything else, but right about the result. Conscience had led directly to catastrophe. What now? Damien forced the words out. You've won. The rebellion is crushed. I'm captured. What's the next move in your grand strategy? Victor's expression went carefully blank. The High Council has voted. Your execution is scheduled for sunset tomorrow in the Palace Square. Public, theatrical, designed to prove that even kings answer to law when they betray it. And her? Damien felt Alara tense beside him. The Thorn heir presents a unique problem. Victor's tone went clinical. Executing her makes her a martyr. Imprisoning her keeps the bloodline alive as a potential rallying point. The council is divided on which option presents less risk. So you're going to debate my murder like it's a policy decision. Alara's voice dripped contempt. How civilized. More civilized than civil war. Victor signaled to his soldiers. Take them both. Separate cells, maximum security. And someone find Kale's body. I want confirmation he's dead this time. Kale got away, Damien thought with fierce satisfaction. At least that much had worked. At least some part of their desperate plan had succeeded. They were dragged through the streets toward military transports, past the bodies of people who'd believed Damien when he'd promised their defiance mattered. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest until breathing felt like drowning. Alara was shoved into a separate transport, but not before she caught his eyes one last time. What passed between them needed no words. Apology, forgiveness, grief for what they'd almost built and what it had cost. Then she was gone, and Damien was alone with Victor and the wreckage of everything he'd tried to become. The transport rumbled toward the palace, that monument to power he'd fled weeks ago. It looked different now, seeing it as a prisoner rather than its master. The towers seemed less majestic and more oppressive, the walls less protective and more confining. Victor sat across from him, studying Damien with the analytical attention of someone examining a failed experiment. "You're wondering if I regret this," Victor said. "If some part of me wishes I'd let you succeed. Do you?" A long silence. Then, "Every day. But wanting something and choosing it are different disciplines. I want a lot of things the Empire can't afford." The honesty was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. Damien leaned back against the transport wall, feeling every wound, every failure, every death weighing on him like stones. "You could have just killed me when we left the palace. Saved everyone the trouble." "I could have." Victor's gaze didn't waver. "But the council wanted proof that rebellion leads only to death. They wanted you captured, tried, executed publicly. A lesson written in blood that even kings aren't above consequences. So I'm a teaching tool now. You always were. From the day they put that crown on your head, you were a symbol before you were a person. I just helped you remember which role mattered more." The palace dungeons were exactly as Damien remembered: cold stone and colder justice, cells designed to break spirits before bodies. They locked him in isolation, standard protocol for high-value prisoners. No light except what filtered through a slot in the door. No sound except dripping water in his own breathing. Time became meaningless. Hours or days, he couldn't tell. They brought food irregularly, water that tasted like rust. No word about Alara, about the survivors, about anything except his own impending execution. In the darkness, Damien's mind replayed every decision that had led here. Meeting Alara. Choosing to save her instead of executing her as the council had eventually demanded. Running rather than fighting from a position of strength. Building a rebellion on hope instead of strategy. Each choice had felt right in the moment. Each one had been a step toward catastrophe. Victor had been right about one thing. Conscience was a luxury that led to consequences. Damien had spent 10 years as a cold, calculating king who made brutal choices without flinching. The Empire had functioned under that approach. Imperfectly, unjustly, but it had functioned. Then he'd met a woman with honey-green eyes who'd looked at him and seen a human being worth saving, and he'd thrown it all away for the possibility of being something better than his throne required. The tragedy was that better had turned out to be worse. His attempt at morality had killed more people than his years of calculated cruelty ever had. He was contemplating this bitter irony when the cell door opened. Not Victor. Not guards. A figure in dark robes with the hood pulled low, moving with the careful stealth of someone who shouldn't be here. The hood came down, revealing a woman Damien recognized from council meetings. Lady Saris of House Blackwood, one of the younger members, barely 30, known for her sharp mind and sharper political instincts. "My lord," her voice was barely above a whisper. "We don't have much time." Damien didn't move from where he sat against the wall. "Why are you here?" "Because Victor made a mistake." Lady Saris pulled out a small bundle, started laying out items. A guard uniform, a knife, documents with official seals. He thought crushing your rebellion would end dissent. Instead, it's revealed how far the council will go to maintain power. Half the noble houses are questioning whether they'll be next. Several military commanders are refusing orders. The Empire is fragmenting. "Good, let it burn." She looked at him sharply. "You don't mean that, don't I?" Damien's laugh was bitter. "I tried reform. I tried revolution. Both led to massacres. Maybe collapse is the only path left. Or maybe there's a fourth option." Lady Saris crouched to eye level. "The council is divided. Not just about the Thorn heir, about everything. Trade policy, military deployment, succession law. Victor presented a unified front, but it's cracking. If you escaped, if you survived the execution, it would shatter completely. Into civil war, possibly. She didn't flinch from the assessment, or into restructuring. Several of us have been working toward council-led governance instead of absolute monarchy. We need the alpha system dismantled from within, not destroyed from without. You could be the catalyst. By escaping my own execution. Damien felt exhaustion settling into his bones. How exactly does that work? Lady Saris began explaining, her words coming fast and urgent. A sympathetic guard during the transport to the square. A staged attack by supposed loyalists. Chaos, smoke, you disappearing into the crowd. They'd find a body later, not yours, but burned beyond recognition. Close enough? It was elaborate, risky, dependent on a dozen things going right. It was also possibly the last chance he'd ever get. And Alara? Lady Saris hesitated. That's more complicated. She's being held in a different section, under different guards. I might be able to arrange her escape, but not on the same timeline. You'd have to trust that, no. The word came out flat and final. Either we both get out, or neither of us does. My lord, be reasonable. Lady Saris' frustration showed through her control. She's one person. The future of the Empire is at stake. She's the person I gave up a crown for. Damien met her eyes. I'm not sacrificing her to save a system I spent weeks trying to dismantle. Either your plan includes her, or I walk to that execution tomorrow and let Victor have his victory. The silence stretched. Lady Saris studied him like she was recalculating complex equations. Finally, you really did change, didn't you? The old king would have taken the escape and rationalized leaving her behind. The old king got a lot of people killed through cold calculation. I'm trying something different, even if it kills you both. Especially then. At least we'd die having chosen each other over power. There's a symmetry to that. Lady Saris stood, gathering her materials. I'll see what I can do. But understand, if this fails, if either of you is caught during the attempt, the consequences will be worse than a clean execution. They'll make examples that last generations. Understood. She paused at the door. Why her? Of all the choices you could have made, all the alliances you could have built, why risk everything for a healer from the outer districts? Damien considered this question, reaching for truth in the darkness. Because she looked at the worst parts of me and didn't flinch. Because she believed I could be better than my breeding. Because when everything else was politics and power, she was real. That mattered more than crowns or bloodlines or any of the things I'd been taught to value. That's not very strategic. No. But it's honest. And I'm tired of strategies that require me to betray my own humanity. Lady Saris nodded once, then slipped back into the corridor. The door closed, leaving Damien alone with the possibility of escape and the certainty that nothing about tomorrow would go according to anyone's plan. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning in the dark. When the door opened again, it was Victor. He stood in the threshold, backlit by corridor torches, his face unreadable. For a long moment, neither spoke. Lady Saris came to see you. It wasn't a question. Did she? Victor's mouth quirked. Don't insult us both by pretending otherwise. This cell has better ears than you think. Damien felt ice forming in his chest. So you know about the escape plan? I know there is one. I don't know the details, which means Lady Saris is better at conspiracies than I gave her credit for. Victor stepped inside, let the door close behind him. I also know you made her survival conditional on the Thorn heir's escape. Let me guess, you're here to convince me that's foolish. I'm here to tell you that girl is going to get you killed. Victor's voice carried something that might have been genuine concern. Everything you've lost, every person who died in that warehouse district, every bit of the chaos consuming the Empire right now, it all traces back to the moment you chose her over your throne. Yes. That's it? Just yes? Damien leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What else do you want me to say? That I regret it? I don't. That I'd choose differently if I could go back? I wouldn't. You taught me to think strategically, to calculate costs against benefits. This is me applying that lesson. She's worth more than the crown ever was. Victor shook his head slowly. I trained you better than this. You trained me to be a weapon that maintained an unjust system. Damien's voice was quiet but certain. I'm choosing to be something else, even if it kills me. Especially if it kills me. Because dying for something real beats living for something hollow. The silence that followed was heavy with everything they'd been to each other. Teacher and student, commander and king, something that had almost resembled friendship before betrayal had burned it to ash. The execution is at sunset tomorrow. Victor's tone had gone formal, distant. You'll be transported at mid-afternoon for public viewing before the event. I'd advise against attempting escape. You won't succeed, and failure will be worse than the clean death we've planned. We? Damien smiled without humor. You mean the clean death you've planned to prove rebellion has consequences? Victor reached for the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I took no pleasure in this. You were the best student I ever had. What you could have been if you hadn't let sentiment corrupt your judgment. I know what I could have been. A better version of you. Efficient, ruthless, hollow. I'll take corruption over that emptiness. Victor left without responding. The door closed with the finality of a coffin lid. Damien sat in darkness, contemplating the choice he'd just committed to. Escape with Alara or die trying. No middle ground, no strategic retreat. For once in his calculated life, he was choosing based on what his heart demanded rather than what his head advised. It felt terrifying and necessary in equal measure. Somewhere in this same prison, Alara was sitting in her own cell, facing her own death, probably cursing him for dragging her into this catastrophe. The thought made him smile despite everything. She'd curse him, sure. Then she'd fight like hell to survive because that's who she was. Someone who refused to surrender, even when surrender was the smart move. They were perfect for each other in the most catastrophic way possible. The hours crawled toward execution. Damien didn't sleep, didn't eat the food they brought. Just sat in darkness, conserving strength, running through every possible scenario Lady Sarah's plan might unfold into. Most of them ended in death. A few ended in escape. None ended in anything resembling victory. But victory had stopped being the goal weeks ago. Now he was just trying to die on his own terms instead of theirs. When guards finally came for him, Dawn was bleeding through the cell's slot window. They chained his hands, his feet, enough metal to restrain someone they still feared despite his capture. The walk through the palace was a gauntlet of stairs. Servants he'd commanded, nobles he'd negotiated with, guards who'd once sworn loyalty, all watching his fall with expressions ranging from pity to satisfaction. This was the theater Victor had orchestrated, the public lesson in what happened to kings who forgot their place. They put him in a cell with a window facing the execution square. Standard psychological warfare. Make him watch the preparations. Let fear erode whatever courage he had left. Damien watched workers constructing the scaffold and felt nothing. Fear had been replaced by a strange calm, the acceptance that came from making a choice and committing to its consequences. The square began filling as sunset approached. Thousands of people drawn by the spectacle of a fallen king's death. Some came for justice, some for entertainment, most because watching power devour itself was a reminder of their own mortality and limited agency. Alara was brought in around mid-afternoon, placed in a cell adjacent to his. She looked like hell, bruised, exhausted, furious. When their eyes met through the connecting bars, a lifetime of communication passed in silence. "You look terrible," she finally said. "You should see the other guy." "I did." "You killed him." Her attempt at humor cracked halfway through. "This is insane. We're actually going to die here." "Maybe." Damien moved closer to the bars. "Or maybe Lady Saris pulls off her conspiracy and we escape into an uncertain future of running and hiding." "She told you about that?" "Briefly. I made survival conditional on getting us both out." Alara's expression went soft, then hardened again. "You're an idiot. You should have taken the escape when you had the chance." "Probably. But then I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have saved you. This way. At least I'll know I tried." "We're going to die, Damien." The reality in her voice was devastating. "Whatever Lady Saris is planning, it won't work. Victor's too smart, too thorough. We're not walking away from this." "Then we don't walk." Damien reached through the bars, felt her fingers wrap around his. "We burn. Together. Better than dying alone. That's not comfort." "No. But it's truth. And I'm done lying, especially to you." The sun crawled toward the horizon, each minute bringing them closer to an ending neither had chosen, but both had earned through their choices. Outside, the crowd swelled. Inside, two people who'd tried to be better than their circumstances held on to each other and waited for whatever came next. The door opened. Guards, weapons drawn, prepared for resistance. "Time to go," one of them said. Damien squeezed Alara's hand one last time, then released it. They were pulled apart, dragged toward separate transports. The last thing he saw before they shoved him into darkness was her face, defiant even in defeat. Whatever happened next, they'd face it as they'd faced everything since that first moment in the palace medical wing, refusing to break, refusing to surrender the parts of themselves that made them human, even if it killed them, especially if it killed them. The transport smelled like old blood and older fear. Damien counted the seconds between heartbeats, each one bringing him closer to the scaffold or whatever salvation Lady Ceres had orchestrated. The chains around his wrists were regulation military issue, designed to restrain without comfort. His shoulders ached from the position they'd locked his arms in. Good. Pain meant he was still alive, still capable of feeling something other than the numbness that had been creeping in since Victor's betrayal. The transport lurched to a stop. Damien heard crowd noise beyond the walls, that particular roar of thousands of people gathering to witness spectacle. Public executions had always drawn masses in Valdris. Blood and theater, the Empire's favorite combination. He'd watched his father preside over dozens of them, the old king's face carved from stone as he pronounced sentences and watched them carried out. Damien had thought it was strength back then. Now, he understood it was just another form of cowardice dressed up as duty. The door opened. Sunlight stabbed through, painting everything in shades of rust and gold. Sunset approaching. They'd timed this perfectly for maximum visual impact. A king dying as the sun set on his reign. Victor's theatrical touch, no doubt. Guards hauled him out roughly, their hands impersonal and efficient. They'd done this before. Probably would do it again. Just another prisoner, another execution, another day maintaining the Empire's appetite for control. The fact that this prisoner used to wear their crown made no difference to their grip. The square was massive, designed to hold 10,000 people for proclamations and celebrations. Today it held at least that many, packed shoulder to shoulder, straining for glimpses of the fallen king. Damien scanned faces as they dragged him toward the scaffold. Some showed satisfaction, others grief, most just curiosity. He was a story they'd tell their children. The king who chose a woman over his throne and paid for it with his life. Let them tell it. As long as they remembered he'd made a choice, that was enough. The scaffold loomed ahead, freshly constructed from dark wood that would show the bloodwell. A headsman's block sat center stage, the wood stained from previous uses. Efficient and economical. The Empire wasted nothing, not even execution equipment. Movement caught his eye. A second transport arriving from the opposite side of the square. Alara. They were bringing her out to watch, making her bear witness before they decided her own fate. The cruelty was intentional, designed to break whatever resistance she had left. She emerged into the dying light, and their eyes locked across 50 yards of crowd and chaos. Even battered and chained, she stood like something unbroken. Her chin was up, her gaze direct. No tears, no pleading. Just that same fierce defiance that had made him fall for her in a palace corridor that felt like a lifetime ago. This was the woman worth dying for. Not because she was perfect, but because she refused to be anything other than exactly herself, even when it would have been easier to bend. The guards positioned him at the scaffold steps. A herald was reading charges in a voice designed to carry across the square. Treason against the throne. Conspiracy to overthrow lawful governance. Abandonment of duty, murder of Lord Cassian, each charge technically accurate, each one missing the point entirely. He'd committed the real crime of remembering he was human before he was king. Victor appeared on a raised platform to the left of the scaffold, flanked by high council members in their ceremonial robes. He looked every inch the dutiful commander, face composed, bearing perfect. Only someone who'd known him for 15 years would catch the tension in his shoulders. The way his jaw was clenched just slightly too tight. Good. Let him feel something. Let this cost him even a fraction of what it had cost everyone else. The herald finished reading charges. A priest stepped forward to offer final rites. Damien waved him off. He'd made his peace with whatever came next.
Didn't need ceremonial absolution from a system built on the backs of people it had failed. The crowd quieted as they moved him up the scaffold steps. Each wooden board creaked under his weight, announcing his approach to death with mundane sounds that felt absurd against the magnitude of the moment. This was it. The end of King Damien Voss, reduced to footsteps on fresh timber. He knelt at the block. The wood was cold against his throat. From this angle, he could see Alara being forced to her knees in the crowd, guards surrounding her, making sure she watched every second. Her face was a mask of controlled fury. Hold on, he thought at her. Whatever Lady Saris planned, hold on just a little longer. The headsman took his position. Damien could see his boots, worn leather that had walked this path before. Professional executioner, probably performed dozens of these. Just another job. Another skull to separate from shoulders. Victor's voice cut through the twilight. Damien Voss, you have been found guilty of high treason and crimes against the Empire. Have you any final words? The question was pro forma, expected. Most condemned prisoners begged or proclaimed innocence. Damien had something different in mind. He lifted his head as much as the block allowed, projecting his voice across the square the way he'd been trained to address crowds. I regret nothing. Every choice that brought me here was made with open eyes and clear conscience. I chose mercy over cruelty. I chose love over power. I chose to see the people of this empire as human beings rather than resources to exploit. If that's treason, then I'm guilty. But history will judge which of us was truly loyal to what this empire could have been instead of what it became. The silence that followed was absolute. 10,000 people holding their breath. Victor's expression went carefully blank. Execute the sentence. The headsman raised his axe, and the world exploded into chaos. It started with smoke. Thick, choking clouds erupting from dozens of points around the square simultaneously. The crowd panicked, people shoving and screaming, trying to escape what they assumed was fire. In the confusion, figures emerged from the smoke wearing nondescript clothing and carrying weapons. Not Lady Sarah's conspiracy. Something bigger. Something that looked like coordinated insurrection. Damien felt hands on his chains, someone working the locks with practiced speed. The metal fell away and he rolled off the block as the headsman's axe came down, burying itself in wood where his neck had been heartbeats earlier. Move, a familiar voice hissed in his ear. Kyle, alive and furious and very much not dead. We've got maybe 90 seconds before they regroup. Alara, already being extracted. Kyle hauled Damien to his feet, pressed a blade into his hand. Trust me and run or die here. Your choice. Damien ran. They plunged into the smoke and crowd, Kyle navigating with the certainty of someone who'd mapped every escape route. Around them, fighting had erupted. The figures in nondescript clothing were engaging Victor's elite guard with the practiced efficiency of trained soldiers, not rebels, not civilians. Military personnel who'd chosen the wrong side of this fight from the Council's perspective. This wasn't Lady Saris's escape plan. This was a coup. The realization hit as they broke free of the crowd into a side street. Lady Saris hadn't been planning to save him. She'd been planning to use his execution as the trigger for something much larger. A coordinated uprising of military commanders and noble houses who'd decided the High Council had overreached. Damien's attempted salvation had been weaponized into civil war. Kyle pulled him into a building, upstairs that groaned under their combined weight. They emerged onto a roof with a view of the square below. The smoke was clearing, revealing the true scope of what was happening. Hundreds of soldiers fighting each other, formations fracturing along loyalty lines, the careful order Victor had maintained collapsing into violent chaos. "Where's Alara?" Damien's voice was raw. Kyle pointed. 3 buildings over, another extraction team was moving across rooftops with a small figure between them. Even at this distance, Damien recognized her movements. She's alive. For now. Kyle's expression was grim. But this whole thing is about to get worse. How could it possibly get worse? As if in answer, horns sounded from multiple directions. Not execution horns, war horns, the kind that summoned full military response. Victor had called in reinforcements, probably every loyal unit within an hour's march. The city was about to become a battlefield. "We need to get out of Valdris." Damien was already moving toward the next building, toward Alara.
Get everyone out before Victor seals the gates. Too late for that. Kyle followed, matching his pace. He sealed them 10 minutes ago. Nothing in or out until this is resolved. We're trapped in here with two armies about to tear each other apart. Then we fight our way out. With what army? Kale's laugh was bitter. We've got maybe 200 fighters scattered across the city. Victor has thousands. The noble houses backing this coup have their private forces, sure, but they're not coordinated. This was supposed to be a surgical strike. Extract you and Alara. Disappear before anyone organized resistance. Instead, it turned into open warfare. Because I gave a speech instead of dying quietly. Because Victor saw this coming and prepared accordingly. Kyle's voice carried grudging respect. Your old commander is 3 moves ahead of everyone. He wanted this fight. Probably orchestrated it to justify crushing every house that's been questioning council authority. They reached the building where Alara's extraction team had disappeared into. Damien kicked open a rooftop door, descended into darkness with blade ready. The building was empty, abandoned years ago by the look of the decay, perfect for moving unseen. Alara, he called into the shadows. It's me. She emerged from a side room flanked by 2 soldiers Damien didn't recognize. Her chains were gone, replaced with a sword that looked comfortable in her grip. Blood spattered her clothes, but she was moving without favoring any injuries. Their eyes met, and something fundamental shifted. They'd almost died. They'd been separated, dragged toward executions, forced to watch each other's powerlessness. And they'd survived. Somehow, against every calculation, they were still breathing. Alara crossed the distance between them and kissed him with the desperate intensity of someone who'd thought they'd never get another chance. Damien kissed back, tasting blood and smoke and survival. When they broke apart, Kyle was pointedly looking elsewhere. Touching as this is, we need a plan. The plan is we get out of the city. Damien kept one hand on Alara's arm, needing the physical confirmation she was real. How? One of Alara's escorts spoke up, a woman with commander insignia. The river gate. It's the least defended because the current makes water approach nearly impossible. If we can reach it before Victor locks down that sector, we'll have to fight through half the city to get there. Kyle was already moving toward a window overlooking the street, and Victor will figure out that's our target the moment we start moving in that direction. So we create a diversion. Alara's voice was steady. Split our forces, make him think we're heading for the main gates while the actual extraction moves toward the river. That's suicide for the diversion team. Damien felt old instincts kicking in, strategic calculation reasserting itself. We'd be asking people to die as decoys. We're already asking them to die fighting a war they can't win. Alara met his eyes. At least this way some of us might survive. She was right. The mathematics were brutal but clear. A diversion would cost lives but might save more. The kind of calculation he'd made hundreds of times as king, the kind he'd fled the throne to stop making. Except now the stakes were different. These weren't abstract citizens to be sacrificed for strategic advantage. These were people who'd risked everything to save him and Alara. People with names and families and futures being traded for the slim possibility of escape. The weight of that choice crushed down on him like physical force. I'll lead the diversion. The words came out before conscious thought could stop them. I'm what Victor really wants. If I'm visible moving toward the main gate, he'll commit everything to capturing me. The room went silent. Kyle shook his head slowly. That's not happening. It's the only move that makes sense. Damien forced his voice to stay level. You get Alara to the river gate. I draw Victor's forces away. Once you're clear of the city, you disappear. Build something better from the ashes. No. Alara's voice cut like broken glass. We don't split up. Not again. Not after everything we've been through to stay together. Damien took her hands, feeling them shake. That's exactly why this works. Victor knows I won't abandon you. If he sees me running one direction and you're somewhere else, he'll assume it's a trap. But if we're separated and I'm making a desperate play for freedom alone, he'll believe it. You'll die. Probably. The admission hurt more than any wound, but you'll live. That's worth it. Not to me. Alara's eyes were blazing. You don't get to make that choice for both of us. We survive together or we don't survive at all. Noble sentiment. Kale's voice was flat. Also strategically stupid. Damien's right. This is the play that gives us the best chance. Then we find a different play. Alara rounded on him.
One that doesn't require sacrificing the person we just risked a coup to save. There isn't one. The female commander spoke quietly. I've run every scenario. This is the only approach with better than 10% survival odds for anyone. The building shook suddenly, explosion somewhere close. The war was intensifying, spreading through Valdris like fire through dry wood. They had minutes at best before this position became untenable. Damien made the choice his throne had trained him for. Kael, get her out. Use whatever force necessary. Don't you dare! Alara's hand went to her sword. Don't you dare turn this into another moment where men decide women's fates without their input. I'm not deciding your fate. Damien's voice went hard. Command waited. I'm accepting mine. You can hate me for it later, but only if you survive to do so. He moved toward the door before she could respond. Kael grabbed his arm. This is the stupidest brave thing I've ever seen. The strategist's voice carried something that might have been respect or might have been grief. Don't waste it by dying too quickly. I'll do my best. Damien took the stairs 3 at a time, emerging into streets that had transformed into war zones in the minutes since his extraction. Buildings burned. Bodies lay where they'd fallen. The careful order Victor had maintained was fracturing into beautiful, terrible chaos. He ran toward the main gate with sword drawn, making himself visible, a target too valuable to ignore. Within 2 blocks, elite guard soldiers spotted him. Within 3, they were in pursuit. Within 4, Victor himself appeared on horseback, rallying forces with the practiced ease of someone who'd commanded armies for decades. There you are. Victor's voice carried across the carnage. I knew you couldn't resist the theatrical gesture. Damien spun to face him, blade ready. Thought you said I was predictable. You are. Victor dismounted, drew his own sword. You choose conscience over strategy every time. Makes you easy to manipulate. They circled each other while around them the city tore itself apart. This was it. The confrontation that had been building since the moment Damien had chosen to save Alara instead of executing her. Teacher versus student. Old order versus new possibility. Empire versus humanity. The clash when their blades met was inevitable and brutal. Victor fought with the precision of someone who'd taught Damien every technique he knew. But Damien had spent weeks fighting for survival rather than sport, and desperation had sharpened his edge. They traded blows in a deadly rhythm, neither gaining clear advantage. Around them, soldiers from both sides stopped to watch. The Alpha King versus his former commander, fighting for the soul of an empire that had already fractured beyond repair. You could have been great. Victor's blade scraped along Damien, searching for an opening, could have ruled for decades, shaped this empire into something truly powerful. I didn't want power. Damien riposted, felt his sword bite air where Victor had been. I wanted to stop being the monster power required. Then you were always going to fail. Victor lunged, his blade finding Damien's shoulder, opening a wound that burned like fire. Power doesn't negotiate with conscience, it crushes it. Damien staggered, switched hands, kept fighting. Maybe, but at least I tried. The battle raged for minutes that felt like hours. Damien could feel his strength fading, blood loss and exhaustion catching up. Victor was barely winded, fighting with the economical movements of someone conserving energy for a long engagement. This was unwinnable. Damien had known that from the start. The point wasn't to win. The point was to buy time for Alara to escape. He just had to last long enough. Victor seemed to sense his strategy. A diversion. Clever. Where is she really going? Damien smiled through blood. Like I tell you, you don't have to. Victor's next strike was brutal, driving Damien to his knees. I've got soldiers at every gate. The moment anyone tries to leave, I'll know. Then I guess you'd better hope you've got enough soldiers. Damien drove upward, his blade finding Victor's side, feeling it slide between ribs. Victor's eyes went wide. Surprise more than pain. He stumbled backward, hand going to the wound. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other. 15 years of shared history, of teacher and student, of something that might have been friendship before ambition had poisoned it. You were the best of us. Victor's voice was fading. Could have saved the empire if you'd just been willing to pay the price. I paid it. Damien felt his own strength failing, just not the way you wanted. Victor fell to his knees, then to his side. The great commander brought down by the student he'd trained,
Around them, soldiers watched in stunned silence as their leader bled out on cobblestones. Damien tried to stand and couldn't. His legs weren't working right. Too much blood loss, too many wounds. He'd bought the time, paid the price. Now came the cost. Elite Guard soldiers surrounded him, weapons drawn. Without Victor to command them, they hesitated, unsure whether to execute the fallen king or take him prisoner again. The decision was made for them by the arrival of Lady Cerys and what looked like half the remaining noble houses of Valdris. They rode in on horseback, flanked by their private armies, and the elite guard recognized the shift in power dynamics. "Stand down!" Lady Cerys's voice carried absolute authority. The High Council's reign ended the moment Victor fell. "We're establishing new governance effective immediately." She dismounted, approached Damien where he lay bleeding. "You absolute fool! I told you to escape, not fight a duel with the Empire's best swordsman." "Had to." Damien's voice was getting distant. "Had to buy time for—" "I know what you were buying." Lady Cerys gestured to her physicians. She made it to the river gate. Cale got her out along with about 50 others. "They're gone." "Good." The word came out barely above a whisper. "That's good. Don't you dare die." Lady Cerys' face swam in and out of focus. "We need you for what comes next. The restructuring, the council-led governance. All of it requires— The Empire doesn't need me." Damien felt darkness creeping in at the edges. It needs people willing to burn it down and build something better. I did my part. Someone else can finish. He closed his eyes, feeling the cold spreading from his wounds. He'd done it. Alara was safe. The system was fracturing. Victor was dead. All the pieces were in motion for something different to emerge from the ashes. Whether that something was better remained to be seen, but at least he'd given it a chance. Consciousness faded to the sound of physicians shouting orders and Lady Cerys demanding impossible miracles. Damien let it go, surrendering to the darkness that promised an end to choices and consequences. He'd earned the rest. The last thing he felt was rain starting to fall, washing blood from cobblestones and corpses, and a city that would rebuild itself into something new or collapse into something worse. Either way, he wouldn't see it. His story ended here, in blood and rain, and the bitter satisfaction of knowing he'd chosen humanity over empire, even when it cost him everything. Somewhere beyond the city walls, Alara was alive and free. That would have to be enough. The darkness took him completely. And in the space between dying and dead, Damien Voss found something that might have been peace or might have been surrender, and discovered he could no longer tell the difference. Dying was supposed to be peaceful. That's what the stories promised, a gentle fading into darkness, release from pain and consequence. But Damien Voss discovered that dying was actually a series of brutal moments where consciousness fought against the inevitable, each second a small war between surrender and survival. The rain fell harder. He could feel it on his face, cold and persistent, washing away blood that his body no longer had the pressure to pump. Voices swirled around him, physicians barking orders, Lady Cerys demanding miracles, soldiers arguing about what came next. All of it distant, like hearing the world from underwater. This was supposed to be the end. Clean, decisive, the price paid for choosing humanity over empire. He'd bought Alara her freedom with his life. That transaction should have been complete. But his body, that stubborn thing that had survived 10 years of kingship and weeks of rebellion, refused to cooperate with poetic endings. The physicians worked on him with desperate efficiency, their hands moving through procedures he couldn't see but could feel. Pressure, pain, the awful sensation of being held together by will and improvisation. Lady Cerys's voice cut through the chaos, issuing commands with the authority of someone who'd stepped into the power vacuum Victor's death had created. Keep him alive. Whatever it takes, keep him breathing. Why? Damien tried to ask, but the word came out as a wet cough that tasted like copper. Because the Empire needs a symbol, and you're the only one we've got. Lady Cerys's face appeared above him, rain-soaked and fierce. You don't get to die heroically and escape the consequences. You started this reformation. You're going to live to see it through. The arrogance of it would have made him laugh if he'd had the breath. She was commanding him to survive the way kings commanded subjects to obey, as if death itself would bend to political necessity. The world went dark again, consciousness slipping like water through fingers. When awareness returned, it came with the smell of herbs and clean linen. Damien opened his eyes to a ceiling he didn't recognize, rough timber instead of palace marble, humble and functional. Pain radiated from a dozen places across his body, sharp reminders that he was still among the living whether he'd chosen to be or not. A figure sat beside the bed, silhouetted against lamplight. For a moment his heart surged, hoping, but no. Too tall, too broad. Kale leaned forward, his face carrying the weight of someone who'd spent days without sleep. "Welcome back. Thought we'd lost you twice." Physicians said it was a coin flip whether your body remembered how to keep working. Damien's throat was raw. "How long?" "6 days since the square. 3 since you stopped actively dying." Kale poured water from a pitcher, helped Damien drink. "The city's still a mess, but it's stabilizing. Lady Saris and the reform houses have established a provisional council. They're dismantling the old Alpha system, piece by piece." "And Alara?" The question hung between them. Kael's expression shifted, something complicated passing across his features. "Safe. Beyond the border territories, last confirmed location. She wanted to come back when she heard you'd survived, but don't." Damien's voice was stronger now. "Don't let her. This city's still dangerous, and she's got a target on her back the size of her bloodline. She knows. Doesn't mean she's happy about it." Kael stood, moved to the window. The woman stubborn as bedrock. "Says she didn't survive all this just to hide in the mountains while you recover. Smart and stubborn." Damien felt something in his chest that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. "Tell me what happened after I went down." Kael recounted the aftermath in clinical detail. Victor's death had fractured the elite guard's command structure. Half had surrendered immediately. The other half had fought until Lady Saris's combined noble forces overwhelmed them. The High Council had attempted to maintain authority, but collapsed when 3 of its 7 members defected to the reform movement. The old order had crumbled in the space of an afternoon. Everything Damien's father had built and Damien had maintained disintegrating like sandcastles against tide. The Provisional Council's first act had been abolishing the Alpha King position entirely. No more hereditary rule, no more bloodline supremacy. Governance by elected representatives from all territories, subject to term limits and accountability measures that would have been unthinkable a month ago. "They're calling it the Commonwealth Accord." Kael's voice carried something that might have been hope. "It's messy and imperfect and probably won't survive its first major crisis, but it's different, actually different. And they want me for what exactly? Symbol of the old order reformed? Something like that." Kael returned to the bedside. "They're arguing about your title. Some want you executed still, tying up loose ends. Some want you exiled. Lady Saris is pushing for a third option. Keep you around as a reminder of what happens when power tries to be merciful. A living lesson and the cost of choosing conscience." "That's horrifying. That's politics. You should be used to it." Damien closed his eyes, feeling exhaustion pulling at him despite days of forced rest. His body was healing, but his mind was a different matter. The weight of everyone who'd died in the warehouse district, in the square, in the streets during those brutal hours of urban warfare. It pressed down on him with gravitational force. Victor had been right about one thing. Conscience came with consequences, and the bill was always payable in blood. The door opened. Lady Saris entered with the brisk efficiency of someone managing a dozen crises simultaneously. She looked older than Damien remembered, the stress of revolutionary governance aging her in fast forward. "You're awake. Good. We need to talk about your future." "I don't have one." Damien's voice was flat. "I gave it up when I walked away from the crown." "Don't be dramatic. It doesn't suit you." Lady Saris pulled up a chair, sat with the posture of someone prepared for long negotiation. "Your future is exactly what we need to discuss because it impacts everyone else's. The Provisional Council is divided on what to do with you. Execute the last symbol of the old order and risk making you a martyr. Exile you and risk you becoming a rallying point for counter-revolution. Or rehabilitate you into the new system as proof that change is possible." "I vote for exile." "Your vote doesn't count. You're the subject of the debate, not a participant." Lady Saris's smile was sharp. "But I'm here to offer a fourth option you might actually tolerate." She laid out a proposal that was simultaneously elegant and terrible. The outer territories, the places imperial governance had systematically neglected, needed leadership. Not kings or lords, but organizers who understood both the brutality of the old system and the fragile hope of the new one. Damien would go there, not as ruler, but as coordinator, help rebuild what the empire had broken, use his name and reputation as tools for reconstruction rather than destruction. It's a long, unglamorous exile disguised as service. Lady Saris was nothing if not honest. You'll spend years in places that don't have palaces or power. You'll answer to people you used to govern. You'll watch the empire you bled for transform into something you barely recognize. And if you do it well, history might remember you as the king who chose to become human. And if I refuse, then we execute you quietly, bury you in an unmarked grave, and move on. Lady Saris stood, smoothing her dress. Those are the options. Choose one. She left before he could respond, the door closing with soft finality. Damien spent the next week recovering in that humble room while the city outside remade itself. Kale brought reports, trials of High Council members, redistribution of seized assets, border territories declaring independence, and then negotiating reintegration under the new Commonwealth structure. The old empire dying in pieces while something uncertain struggled to be born. He should have felt triumphant. This was what he'd wanted, wasn't it? The system dismantled, power redistributed, the possibility of justice replacing the guarantee of oppression. Instead, he felt hollowed out, scraped raw by the understanding that revolution's cost was always measured in the dead. The 300 who'd stood with him in the warehouse district, the citizens caught in crossfire during the square uprising, even Victor, who'd been wrong about everything except the price of change, all of them gone so that something better might exist. The mathematics didn't comfort him the way they once had. On the 8th day, when he could walk without collapsing, Kael brought him new clothes. Simple, functional, nothing that marked him as anything special. They fit the person he'd become. Not a king, not even a leader, just a man trying to figure out what came after his entire world had burned down. The Provisional Council wants an answer. Kael's voice was gentle. About the outer territories. I know. What are you going to tell them? Damien looked out this window at Valdris, the city that had been his prison and his throne. Smoke still rose from buildings damaged in the fighting. People moved through streets with the careful wariness of survivors who weren't sure if the danger had passed or just paused. I'm going to tell them yes, not because I want to, but because refusing means everyone died for nothing. That's not why you're doing it. Kael's perception was uncomfortable. You're doing it because you can't forgive yourself unless you spend the rest of your life trying to fix what you broke. Maybe that's the same thing. It's not. But I'm not going to argue with you about it. They walked through the city toward the Provisional Council chambers, located in what had been a merchant guild hall before the revolution. No throne room, no pageantry, just practical space for practical governance. People recognized Damien as they passed, their reactions ranging from hostile stares to cautious nods. He was both hero and villain, depending on who you asked and what they'd lost. Lady Saris met them at the entrance. The council's ready to hear your decision. The chamber was crowded with representatives from every corner of the empire. Merchants and farmers, former nobles who'd sided with reform, military officers who'd survived the purge. They watched Damien enter with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed contempt. He stood before them without the armor of authority, just a man in borrowed clothes carrying the weight of impossible choices. I accept your proposal. His voice carried to the back of the chamber. I'll go to the outer territories and do what I can to rebuild. Not as a king or a lord, just as someone who owes an unpayable debt and plans to spend his life trying anyway. A representative from the southern district stood, her face hard. Why should we trust you? You wore that crown for 10 years while we starved. Now you want credit for taking it off? I don't want credit. Damien met her eyes. I want a chance to be useful instead of ornamental. If you'd rather execute me, I understand. But if there's work that needs doing and my name can help it get done, I'm offering. The debate that followed was brutal and necessary. People who'd suffered under the old system venting years of rage at the most convenient target. Damien took it without defending himself because what defense existed? He'd been complicit. He'd maintained a system of oppression even if he'd eventually tried to dismantle it. The vote when it came was close. 11 in favor of exile to the outer territories. 8 for execution, 4 abstaining, close enough to survival. Lady Saris approached him after the session. You've got 3 days to prepare. Then you head south to the coastal territories. Kyle will go with you as liaison and to make sure you don't try anything heroically stupid. I thought the vote was settled. It was, but half this council would sleep better knowing you're being watched. Consider it protective custody that looks like partnership. Fair enough? Damien looked around the chamber, the symbol of everything that had changed. One more question. Has anyone heard from Alara? Lady Saris's expression softened fractionally. She sent word through back channels. Says she's waiting for you to stop being an idiot and realize you can't rebuild an empire worth living in if you're doing it alone. Damien felt something shift in his chest, ice beginning to thaw. She said that? More or less. The actual message was longer and contained significantly more cursing, but that was the essence. Lady Saris handed him a sealed letter. She also sent this. Private delivery, completely off the record. He took the letter with hands that only shook slightly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Lady Saris's smile was sharp. You're about to discover that building is harder than destroying, and the outer territories aren't going to welcome you with open arms. This is going to be the most difficult thing you've ever done. Good. Damien tucked the letter inside his jacket. I'm tired of easy choices. The 3 days passed in preparation and goodbye. Kyle assembled supplies and contacts, creating networks that would support their work in territories that had every reason to be hostile. Lady Saris provided documentation that established their authority without making them targets. The Provisional Council gave them resources that were adequate without being generous. Damien spent the evenings reading and rereading Alara's letter until he'd memorized every word. She wrote about the border territories she'd reached, the people helping her establish clinics, the slow work of healing in communities that had been abandoned by imperial governance. She wrote about watching sunsets from mountain ridges and thinking about palace courtyards where they'd first decided to run. She wrote about missing him with an honesty that hurt to read. And she wrote about the future, tentative and careful, as if speaking the possibility out loud might curse it. When this is stable, when you've done whatever penance you think you owe, come find me. We'll build something small and real. A life that doesn't require empires or revolutions. Just two people who survived impossible odds and learned something about who they are in the aftermath. The letter ended simply. I love you. Even when you're being an idiot about sacrifice and duty, especially then. Damien folded it carefully, tucked it into his pack beside the few possessions he was bringing to his new life. On the morning of departure, he walked through Valdris one last time. The palace loomed in the distance, that monument to power he'd inherited and abandoned. Part of him expected to feel nostalgia, some pull toward the authority he'd worn for a decade. He felt nothing except relief. This city had never been his home. It had been his cage, beautiful and deadly, keeping him isolated from everything that made him human. Walking away from it felt like shedding weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. Kyle waited at the southern gate with horses and supplies. The strategist looked almost excited, the prospect of actual construction appealing to someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of destruction. Ready to become a builder? Kael's tone was light, but his eyes were serious. No. Damien swung into the saddle, feeling muscles protest. But I'm ready to try. They rode south through territories that bore scars of imperial neglect. Villages that had once paid taxes and received nothing but contempt in return. Fields that could have fed thousands, but had been left fallow when quota systems made farming unprofitable. People who'd learned to survive despite their government rather than because of it. The work was exactly as difficult as Lady Saris had promised. Communities that had been abandoned didn't trust sudden imperial attention, even when it came wrapped in reform rhetoric. Damien's name opened some doors and slammed others shut. Being the former Alpha King meant everything and nothing depending on who you asked. But slowly, painfully, they built connections. Kael negotiated resource distribution with merchant guilds. Damien listened to complaints and grievances from people who'd never had anyone in power actually hear them before. Together, they started identifying what these territories needed versus what the old empire had decided they should want. It was unglamorous work, the kind that produced no dramatic victories, just incremental progress measured in small improvements to daily life. Fixed irrigation systems, renegotiated trade contracts, medical supplies reaching places that had been making do without. Damien discovered he was good at it, this work of actually serving rather than ruling. Stripped of crown and authority, he could finally be useful in ways that mattered to people's actual lives. 3 months into their southern work, a message arrived via courier. Alara had established a network of clinics in the mountain territories and was requesting assistance expanding them. The message was professional, clinical, all business. Except for the postscript written in different ink. I heard you're doing good work down there. Proud of you for choosing the hard path. When you're ready, there's a mountain ridge I want to show you. Best sunset view in the Commonwealth. Damien read it 3 times, feeling something that might have been joy or might have been terror. The idea of seeing her again, of confronting everything that had happened between them with the clarity of distance and survival, it was overwhelming. Cale noticed his distraction. You should go. The Southern Territories need consistent work, not your constant presence. Cale's logic was infuriatingly sound. We've established networks. Local leaders are stepping up. You hovering won't help them learn to govern themselves. Besides, you're useless when you're pining. Go see her, figure out what comes next, then come back and we'll tackle the Western Territories. It's not that simple. It never is. Kael's expression softened. But sometimes the complicated choice is just doing the thing you're terrified of and seeing what happens. The journey north took 2 weeks through terrain that grew progressively more beautiful and isolated. The mountain territories were where people went to escape imperial reach, building communities in places too remote for governance to bother with. They developed their own systems, their own justice, their own way of existing outside the Empire's shadow. Alara's clinic sat in a valley between peaks that scraped clouds. It was a humble structure, wood and stone, practical and welcoming. People moved around it with the purposeful activity of a place that served essential functions. Damien dismounted, his heart doing complicated things in his chest. He hadn't seen her in 4 months. They'd survived execution, revolution, and the collapse of an empire together. But this was different. This was choosing each other without the adrenaline of survival forcing the decision. She emerged from the clinic before he could decide whether to approach or flee. 4 months had changed her in subtle ways. Sun-darkened skin, hair longer and pulled back practically, clothes that spoke of hard work rather than desperate flight. But her eyes were the same honey green that had stopped him cold in a palace corridor. They stared at each other across 30 feet of valley floor. You came. Her voice carried across the distance. You invited me. I wasn't sure you would. She moved closer, each step deliberate. Thought you might be too busy being noble and self-sacrificing to remember there's a person waiting for you. I remembered. Damien felt his throat tighten. Every day, I remembered. The space between them closed until they were close enough to touch, but neither moved. So much had happened, so much trauma and loss and transformation. The people who'd fled the palace together weren't quite the same people standing here now. I don't know how to do this. Damien's admission was raw. How to be with someone when I'm still figuring out who I am without a crown. Then we figure it out together. Alara reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his. I'm not asking for perfect. I'm asking for honest. Can you do that? I can try. Good enough. She pulled him into an embrace that felt like coming home and starting over simultaneously. They spent days talking through everything that had happened since the square. Alara described her work establishing healing networks, the satisfaction of helping people without the weight of imperial oversight. Damien recounted the brutal negotiations and small victories of rebuilding trust in abandoned territories. And they talked about the future, tentative and careful, building something between them that wasn't defined by running or fighting or survival. I don't want to go back to Valdris, Alara said it one evening as they watched sunset from the ridge she'd mentioned. That city's full of ghosts and might-have-beens. I want to stay here, build something that doesn't require looking over my shoulder constantly. I have to go back. Damien's voice was quiet. Eventually. There's work in the Western Territories, communities that need the same rebuilding we're doing south and here. But I'd like a home to come back to. He turned to face her fully. Something stable and real. A place where I'm not former kings or symbols or lessons in the cost of conscience, just a person who loves someone and wants to build a life with her. Alara's smile was sunrise breaking. That's the smartest thing you've said since we met. They built that life slowly, carefully, between his travels to territories that needed coordination and her expansion of medical networks. It wasn't the grand romance of stories. It was better. More real, more earned, built on the foundation of people who'd seen each other at their worst and chose each other anyway. A year after the revolution, Damien returned to Valdres for the Commonwealth Accord's first formal assembly. The city had transformed, palace converted to government offices, throne room now a legislative chamber. Lady Saris greeted him with the tired satisfaction of someone who'd steered a fragile new system through its infancy. It's holding. Barely, but holding. She looked older, worn down by the endless negotiations democracy required. We've had 3 attempts at counter-revolution, 2 economic crises, and 1 near war with the eastern provinces. But we're still here. That's worth celebrating. Is it? Lady Saris's smile was complicated. Sometimes I wonder if we just traded one set of problems for another. At least under the Alpha system, decisions got made quickly. Quickly doesn't mean correctly. Damien looked around the transformed space. This is messier, slower, more frustrating, but it's also more just. That has to count for something. Tell that to the people still suffering while we debate proper procedure. I will. He'd learned that governance was endless, that fixing systems broke other systems, that progress was measured in generations rather than mandates. But he'd also learned that trying was better than accepting, that messy justice beat efficient oppression. The assembly session was chaos, representatives arguing, factions forming and dissolving, nothing resolved cleanly. Democracy was ugly and inefficient and absolutely necessary. Damien watched from the gallery, no longer a participant, just an observer of what his choice had unleashed. Alara sat beside him, her hand in his. What are you thinking? That I'm glad I'm not down there anymore. His honesty was complete. That I chose right when I walked away. That this is their future to build, not mine. No regrets? He considered the question seriously. The people who died in warehouse districts and palace squares. Victor, who'd been wrong but not entirely. The crown he'd worn and abandoned. All of it was weight he'd carry forever. Plenty of regrets. But not about the choice. Never about choosing you over power. Good answer. She squeezed his hand. Because you're stuck with me now. No crowns to run from. No empires to overthrow. Just life, messy and real. They left Valdres the next day, returning to their mountain valley where the work was smaller but no less important. Damien split his time between territories, helping build the infrastructure the Commonwealth needed to function. Alara expanded her clinics, training others to carry on the work so healing wasn't dependent on any single person. And between the travel and work, they built something that had seemed impossible a year ago. A life that was theirs alone, defined by choice rather than necessity. Years passed. The Commonwealth stabilized, then grew, then faced new crises that required new solutions. The outer territories developed their own identities, no longer appendages to imperial power, but participants in shared governance. Some thrived, some struggled. All learned that freedom came with responsibility that was harder than obedience had been. Damien aged into someone he barely recognized from the cold king who'd stood at palace windows contemplating isolation. Gray touched his temples. Scars from a dozen conflicts marked his skin, but his eyes held something they'd never had during his reign. Peace earned through service rather than demanded through power. Alara built her legacy in lives saved and healers trained, in communities that could care for themselves because she'd taught them how. She never sought power, never leveraged her thorn bloodline for advantage, just lived as herself, completely and without apology. They married in a ceremony so small and private that most people didn't know it had happened. No pageantry, no political alliances, just 2 people making promises to each other in a mountain valley, witnessed by friends who'd survived revolution together. On their 5th anniversary, standing on that ridge watching sunset, Alara asked the question that had been circling unspoken between them. Do you ever miss it? The power, the authority, being able to change things with a word? Damien considered his answer carefully, watching light paint the peaks in shades of fire. Sometimes I miss the efficiency, the ability to see a problem and solve it immediately instead of negotiating through 12 layers of bureaucracy. But power's a seductive lie. It makes you think you're solving problems when you're really just imposing solutions. That's not an answer. No? He pulled her close, feeling her warmth against the mountain cold. I don't miss being king. I don't miss the isolation or the calculations or the constant fear that everything would collapse if I showed weakness. What I miss is the delusion that one person could fix everything. Reality's harder. It requires community, compromise, accepting that progress is incremental and messy. But it's also more honest. Spoken like someone who's made peace with his choices. Most days. Some days, I still wake up feeling the weight of everyone who died because I chose conscience over strategy. Victor was right about the cost, even if he was wrong about everything else. Victor was a brilliant strategist who forgot that empires are built on people, not chess pieces. Alara's voice was firm. You remembered. That's why his empire fell and your legacy survived. It's not my legacy. Damien gestured at the valley below, the clinic, and the community that had grown around it. This is ours. Built by everyone who decided trying was better than accepting. They stood together watching day surrender to night. Two people who'd survived impossible odds to build something impossibly ordinary. A life. A love. A small corner of the world where kindness mattered more than power. Years later, when historians wrote about the fall of the Alpha Empire and the rise of the Commonwealth, they'd argue about Damien Voss's role. Some called him a hero who chose justice over throne. Others called him a coward who abandoned responsibility. Most recognized he was simply human, flawed and fearful and capable of change when circumstances demanded it. But in a mountain valley far from palaces and politics, he was just a man who'd learned that true strength wasn't domination, but the courage to be vulnerable. That love wasn't weakness, but the bravest choice he'd ever made. That walking away from power took more courage than seizing it ever had. He grew old in that valley, surrounded by community and purpose, loved by a woman who'd seen him at his worst and chosen him anyway. When death finally came for him, not through violence but through the gentle erosion of time, he faced it without regret. Alara held his hand as his breathing slowed, her presence the last thing he felt before darkness took him for the final time. I love you. Her whisper was fierce and broken. Thank you for choosing me over the crown. Thank you for being brave enough to be human. Damien's last thought was gratitude that he'd met her, that one glance in a palace corridor had derailed his entire carefully controlled life and replaced it with something messy and real and worth every scar he'd collected along the way. The Alpha King's story ended not with empire but with love, not with power but with peace, not in a palace but in a humble mountain valley where sunset painted the peaks, and two people had built something better than crowns from the ashes of everything that came before. And in the Commonwealth territories below, the work continued. Communities governing themselves, people choosing their leaders, the slow, messy progress of justice, replacing the efficient cruelty of absolute power. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was better. And better was all anyone could ask for in a world that had learned that change required sacrifice, that progress demanded courage, and that sometimes the greatest act of power was choosing to give it away. The sun set on the mountains, painting the valley in gold and shadow, and somewhere in that fading light, the memory of a king who'd chosen to be human instead lived on. Not in monuments or history books, but in the lives of people who'd learned that dignity mattered more than dominion, that mercy outweighed might, and that the truest measure of strength was the courage to admit weakness and keep fighting anyway. The story ended. The legacy continued. And in a world forever changed by one man's choice to see a healer instead of a threat, to choose love over power, to be human instead of king, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.